The Atlanta airport buzzed with the kind of late-night energy that only red-eye travelers understand. Tired eyes, rumpled clothes, and the quiet hum of people trying to stay awake just long enough to board. Among them stood Deshaun Bell, 16 years old, gripping the strap of a backpack so worn it looked like it had survived a decade of storms. He kept checking his boarding pass, not because he was lost, he knew exactly where gate B14 was, but because he couldn't believe it was real. First class. Him. A kid from East Point who'd never even been on a plane before. His grandmother had saved every spare dollar for this moment. Not for a vacation, not for herself, but for him. "You got a mind like a satellite dish, baby," she'd say, tapping his temple with her knobby finger. "You catch signals other folks miss." She passed 3 months ago, but not before slipping an envelope into his hand with a one-way ticket and a note that read, "Don't look back. Build something tall." Now, standing in line, Deshaun felt the weight of those words like a second heartbeat. He was headed to San Francisco for a 6-week summer engineering immersion program, one of only 12 students selected nationwide. He'd aced the application, built a solar-powered water purifier out of old soda bottles and copper wire for his project, and recorded his interview in the school library after hours because his house didn't have reliable Wi-Fi. Getting in felt like winning the lottery. But flying? That was another world. When the gate agent scanned his ticket and said, "Congratulations, you've been upgraded to first class," Deshaun nearly dropped his backpack. He stammered a thank you, cheeks burning, convinced it was a mistake. But the agent just smiled. Happens sometimes when someone cancels last minute. "Enjoy it, young man." Inside the plane, the air smelled faintly of leather and coffee. The seats were wide, cushioned, with more legroom than his entire bedroom back home. He sank into his assigned spot, 1A, and ran his fingers over the armrest like it might vanish. He tried to act calm, but his heart pounded. He wasn't used to luxury. At home, he shared a twin bed with his little brother, patched the roof with duct tape after storms, and walked 2 miles to the library just to charge his phone. This, soft blankets, a personal screen, a flight attendant offering sparkling water, felt like stepping into a movie. He glanced around. Most passengers were older, dressed in business suits or elegant travel wear. Then his eyes landed on her. She sat across the aisle in 1C, struggling to lift a small leather suitcase into the overhead bin. Her silver hair was pinned in a neat twist, and she wore a cream-colored cardigan with pearl buttons. She tried once, then again, her arms trembling slightly. No one else moved. They were already buckled in, eyes on phones or books, lost in their own worlds. Deshaun didn't think. He just stood up. "Ma'am, let me help you with that." She turned, surprised, then offered a tired but warm smile. "Oh, bless you, dear." He lifted the suitcase easily, it wasn't heavy, and slid it into the bin. As he sat back down, he noticed she winced when she lowered herself into the seat. The first-class chairs were plush, but the legroom, while generous, still forced her knees up slightly. He saw the way she adjusted her posture, trying to find comfort. Her fingers pressing into her thigh like she was easing a cramp. A memory flashed. His grandmother on the bus, always giving up her seat to someone older, even when her own knees ached. "Ain't no pride in comfort when somebody else needs it more," she'd say. Before he could second-guess himself, Deshaun leaned over the aisle. "Excuse me, ma'am. I don't mean to be rude, but I'm kinda big and this seat's way more than I need. If you'd feel better in it, I'd be happy to switch with you. I've got a seat in economy, 32F, I think." The woman blinked as if she hadn't heard him right. "You'd give up first class for me?" "Yeah," he said simply. "It's just a seat. You look like you could use the space." For a long moment, she just studied him. His earnest eyes, his slightly too big hoodie, the way he held himself like he was trying not to take up too much room in a world that often told boys like him to shrink. Then her eyes softened. "You're a rare kind of good, aren't you?" "I just try to do what's right," he mumbled, suddenly shy. She nodded slowly. "All right. Thank you. Truly." They swapped seats without fuss. A flight attendant raised an eyebrow but didn't object. After all, it wasn't every day someone voluntarily downgraded. Deshaun settled into 1C, which still felt luxurious compared to anything he knew, but now it carried a quiet satisfaction. He watched out the window as the plane taxied down the runway, city lights blurring into streaks of gold. 5 minutes after takeoff, as the seatbelt sign clicked off and the cabin lights dimmed, a flight attendant approached him. She held a small cream-colored envelope with crisp edges. "This is for you," she said quietly, placing it in his hand. "From Mrs. Whitmore." Deshawn frowned. "Mrs. Whitmore?" "The lady you switched seats with. She asked me to give this to you once we were in the air." He opened the envelope carefully, as if it might dissolve. Inside was a single sheet of thick, elegant paper. In neat, looping handwriting it read, "You reminded me of my grandson. If you ever need anything, truly anything, call this number." Beneath it was a phone number and a name, Eleanor Whitmore. Deshawn read it 3 times. He turned it over, half expecting more, but the back was blank. He looked toward the front of the cabin. Eleanor sat with her eyes closed, hands folded in her lap, a peaceful expression on her face. She didn't glance his way. He folded the note slowly, tucking it into the inner pocket of his backpack, the one he never used, reserved for things that mattered. His mind raced. Was this a test, a joke, or just the kind of thing wealthy people did when they felt generous? He didn't know. But something about the words, "truly anything," felt different. Not flashy, not performative, just real. He leaned his head against the window, the hum of the engines a steady lullaby. Outside, clouds stretched endlessly under moonlight, soft and endless. For the first time in months, he let himself imagine a future that wasn't just about surviving, but about thriving. Maybe, just maybe, this note was a key. But he wasn't ready to use it. Not yet. He'd earned his place in that engineering program on his own. He'd prove he belonged before he asked for help from anyone, even someone as kind as Eleanor Whitmore. Still, as the plane soared westward, cutting through the night sky, Deshawn kept one hand resting lightly on his backpack, right over the pocket where the note lay. It wasn't just paper. It was a possibility. And possibilities, he knew, were rarer than first-class tickets. Hours passed. Passengers dozed. The cabin grew quiet except for the occasional whisper or rustle of a blanket. Deshawn stayed awake, watching the stars, thinking about his grandmother, about the purifier he'd built, about the faces of his teachers who'd stayed late to help him edit his application. He thought about his mom, working double shifts at the diner, and his little brother, who wanted to be an astronaut but didn't have a telescope. He didn't know it yet, but that small act, giving up a seat he'd never expected to have, had already set something in motion far bigger than he could imagine. Kindness, after all, doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in a quiet note, handed over in the dark, waiting for the right moment to unfold. And as the first hints of dawn began to color the horizon somewhere over Texas, Deshawn closed his eyes, not to sleep but to dream, just for a few minutes, of a world where good deeds didn't go unnoticed, and where a boy from East Point could build something tall. Just like his grandmother said, San Francisco hit Deshawn like a cool breath after a long fever. The air smelled different, less like asphalt and fried food, more like salt and eucalyptus. He stepped off the plane with his backpack slung over one shoulder, and Eleanor's note tucked deep in his pocket, folded so many times it was starting to fray at the edges. He didn't take it out again, not yet. It felt too precious, too strange to hold in his hands like an ordinary thing. The engineering program was housed in a sleek building near the bay, all glass and steel, with whiteboards covered in equations that looked like alien script to anyone who hadn't spent nights hunched over textbooks by flashlight. Deshawn was one of only 3 students from the South, and the only one who'd never set foot in a private lab before. But he didn't let that show. He nodded when professors spoke, asked sharp questions during breaks, and stayed late to tinker with circuit boards long after others had gone to grab pizza or nap. Still, the money ran out faster than he expected. His stipend covered meals, but barely. He skipped breakfast most days, saving his meal card for lunch and dinner. He washed his one pair of jeans in the dorm sink and hung them to dry over the shower rod. His shoes had a hole near the toe, but he kept them polished because his grandmother always said, "How you walk says how you think of yourself." Then came the call from home. It was a Tuesday. Rain tapped against the window of the dorm lounge where he sat, reviewing schematics for a mini wind turbine. His phone buzzed, his mom's name flashing on the screen. Her voice was thin, like a thread about to snap. "Baby, I lost the diner job," she said. "New manager says I'm too slow, but I ain't slow. I just got arthritis in my hands now, and the plates are heavy." Deshawn's stomach dropped. He knew what that meant. No job meant no rent. No rent meant his little brother might have to move in with their aunt. who already had 4 kids of her own and barely enough space for them. "I'll figure something out, Mama," he said, voice steady even though his hands were shaking. "Don't you worry." But after he hung up, he sat there for a long time staring at the rain. He thought about calling the number on the note just once, just to ask if there was any kind of part-time work she knew about. Something honest, something that wouldn't feel like begging. He pulled the note from his pocket, unfolded it, read it again. "You reminded me of my grandson. If you ever need anything, truly anything, call this number." The words felt warm, like they'd been written with care, not pity. But pride is a heavy coat to carry, and Deshawn had worn it since he was 10, when he started mowing lawns to help pay the electric bill. Asking for help felt like admitting he wasn't strong enough, and he'd promised himself and his grandmother that he would be. So he didn't call. Instead, he signed up for 2 extra lab assistant shifts, even though they paid in credits, not cash. He walked 3 miles to a grocery store that hired students for overnight stock duty, working from midnight to 4 a.m., then dragging himself back to campus for morning lectures. He survived on instant noodles and donated granola bars from the student pantry. Some nights he'd lie awake listening to the hum of the city, wondering if he'd made a mistake coming here. Maybe he should have stayed home, found a job at the auto shop, helped his mom pay bills instead of chasing dreams that felt too big for someone like him. Meanwhile, across the bay in a quiet neighborhood where the houses had names like Seaview and Willowmere, Eleanor Whitmore sat at her writing desk with a cup of Earl Grey cooling beside her. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about the boy on the plane, the way he'd offered his seat without hesitation, the way he'd looked at her like she was just a person, not some wealthy stranger to impress. She'd asked her longtime assistant, Rosa, to look into him, not to pry, just to understand. Rosa came back with a folder, newspaper clippings about a local science fair winner from East Point, Georgia, a photo of Deshawn accepting a school award with his grandmother beaming beside him, a brief mention in the program's acceptance list. Nothing flashy. Just quiet, consistent effort. Eleanor read it all twice. Then she stared out her window at the fog rolling in from the ocean. Her grandson, Julian, had been like that. Thoughtful, driven, always noticing when someone needed help but never making a show of it. He died at 17, just a year older than Deshawn, after a long fight with leukemia. After that, Eleanor had withdrawn. She stopped hosting her book club, canceled her travel plans, even gave away her piano. The world felt too loud, too sharp without him. But something about Deshawn's gesture, so simple, so uncalculated, had cracked open a door she thought was sealed shut. She didn't reach out. Not yet, she wanted to be sure. So she waited, watching from a distance, letting him find his own footing. But she kept his note in her mind like a promise she might one day be called to keep. Back on campus, Deshawn hit a wall during week 5. His wind turbine prototype kept short-circuiting, and he was too exhausted to troubleshoot it properly. During a group critique, one of the other students, a guy from a private school in Connecticut, snickered when Deshawn's motor sparked. "Maybe stick to fixing bikes," he muttered, just loud enough for others to hear. Deshawn didn't react. He just packed up his tools, jaw tight, and walked out. That night, sitting on the edge of his narrow bed, he finally pulled out Eleanor's note again. The paper was soft now, worn from being handled in secret moments of doubt. He traced the number with his thumb. What if she meant it? Not as charity, not as a handout, but as an offer, like 2 people recognizing something in each other. He picked up his phone, dialed the first 3 digits, then stopped, put it down. He couldn't do it. Not like this. Not while he still had strength in his legs and ideas in his head. But the next morning, something shifted. During a guest lecture on renewable energy in underserved communities, the speaker, a woman who'd grown up in rural Mississippi, said, "Help isn't weakness. It's how we build bridges. The strongest trees grow with support, not in isolation." Deshawn wrote that down in his notebook, underlined it twice. That afternoon, he went to the program director and asked if there were any emergency grants for students facing family hardship. There was one, small but enough to cover his mom's rent for 2 months. He applied, submitted his mom's layoff letter, and included a paragraph about why finishing the program mattered, not just for him, but for the kids back home who needed to see someone like them make it. A week later, he got the grant. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline. And still, he didn't call Eleanor, but he kept the note. Not as a last resort, but as a reminder. Kindness exists. Sometimes it shows up in first class. Sometimes it arrives in silence. And sometimes just knowing it's there is enough to keep you going. One evening, as he walked back from the lab, the city lights shimmering on the water, he passed a little girl struggling to carry a stack of library books. Without thinking, he offered to help. She smiled, shy but grateful. And as he walked her home, he realized he wasn't just doing it because it was right. He was doing it because someone had once seen something in him worth protecting. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real gift Eleanor had given him. Not the note, but the belief that he deserved to be seen. He still didn't call, but for the first time he didn't feel ashamed for considering it, because needing help didn't mean he was failing. It just meant he was human, and being human, he was starting to learn, was the most powerful thing of all. The summer ended like a slow exhale. Deshaun packed his few belongings into his worn backpack, the same one he'd carried onto the plane weeks earlier, though now it held more than just clothes. It held notebooks filled with schematics, a certificate of completion signed by his professors, and a quiet confidence he hadn't boarded with. He'd made it, not just through the program, but through the doubt, the hunger, the nights he'd questioned if he belonged. He'd proven, to himself at least, that he could stand in rooms full of privilege and still hold his ground with nothing but his mind and his manners. Back in East Point, things were quieter than he remembered. The porch swing creaked louder. His little brother had grown half a foot. His mom's hands still ached, but she smiled more now that the rent was covered, even if just for a little while. Deshaun threw himself into helping around the house, fixing the leaky faucet, patching the roof again, tutoring his brother in math every evening. But his mind kept drifting west, to circuits and solar cells and the dream of building something that could change lives, not just his own. Then, on a rainy Thursday in early September, a black town car pulled up in front of their modest house. It looked out of place among the cracked sidewalks and rusted mailboxes, so sleek and silent it might as well have floated down from another world. Deshaun was in the backyard, rewiring an old fan, when he heard the soft crunch of tires on gravel. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked to the front yard, heart thudding for no reason he could name. The back door opened, and out stepped Eleanor Whitmore. She wore a simple navy coat, her silver hair tucked under a light scarf, and held a black umbrella against the drizzle. She looked older than he remembered, more fragile, but her eyes were just as sharp, just as kind. "Deshaun Bell?" she asked, though she clearly already knew. "Yes, ma'am," he said, wiping his palms again, suddenly aware of his oil-stained shirt and muddy sneakers. She smiled. "I hope I'm not intruding. I tried calling the number you gave the program office, but no one answered." He hadn't given anyone a number. Then he remembered. He'd listed his mom's landline on the emergency contact form. "Of course she'd found it. I didn't think you'd come here," he said honestly. "I didn't plan to," she admitted, "but I kept thinking about our flight. And then I heard about the grant you received. You didn't ask for much, did you? Just enough to keep your family afloat while you kept your head above water." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. She stepped closer, rain pattering softly on her umbrella. "May I buy you a cup of tea?" "There's a little cafe down the street. I passed it on my way here. Looks like the kind of place that knows how to make proper chamomile." He glanced back at the house. His mom peeked through the curtain, eyes wide with curiosity. He gave her a small nod, then turned back to Eleanor. "Yes, ma'am. I'd like that." They sat by the window at the corner table, steam curling from their mugs. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and old books. For a while, they just sipped in silence, watching the rain slide down the glass. Then Eleanor spoke, her voice low and steady. "I lost my grandson Julian 5 years ago. He was 17. Smart, gentle, always building things, robots, radios, once a whole hydroponic garden in our garage. He had this laugh, like wind chimes on a summer evening." Deshaun looked down at his hands. He didn't offer empty words like, "I'm sorry." He just listened. "You reminded me of him," she went on. "Not in looks, though you do have the same quiet way about you, but in how you move through the world. Like you're paying attention. Like you care what happens to people you don't even know." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. Not thick, but substantial. "I've watched you from a distance, Deshaun. Not to judge. To understand. And what I've seen. It's rare. You work harder than anyone I've met. And you still find room in your heart to give." She slid the folder toward him. I'd like to help you finish what you started. High school, college, whatever comes after. I'll cover it all. Tuition, books, housing, even a small stipend so you don't have to choose between eating and studying. Deshawn's breath caught. He'd imagined this moment 100 times, but now that it was here, it felt too big to hold. Why? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. You don't even know me. I know enough, she said gently. And I'm not asking for anything in return. No favors, no promises to work for me someday. Just one thing. He looked up. Promise me you'll keep helping others, she said. Even when it costs you something. Even when no one's watching. That's all. The word settled in his chest like a stone finding its place in a riverbed. Solid, right? Necessary. He thought of his grandmother's last words. Make a way where there ain't one. He thought of the little girl with the library books, of his brother's wide eyes when he explained how solar panels worked, of the kids back home who'd never seen someone like them walk into a room full of engineers and belong. I promise, he said. Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just nodded as if sealing a pact older than both of them. They talked for hours after that about engineering, about Julian's love for astronomy, about Deshawn's dream of bringing clean energy to neighborhoods like his. She asked questions, really listened to the answers, never once making him feel like a project or a charity case. By the time the rain stopped, something had shifted between them. Not just giver and receiver, but something closer to family. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor didn't swoop in with grand gestures. She sent a quiet email to his school counselor, arranged for his transcripts to be reviewed by top-tier colleges, and set up a trust fund managed by a neutral advisor so Deshawn wouldn't feel burdened by debt or obligation. She visited once more, this time bringing Julian's old engineering textbooks, dog-eared, annotated, full of dreams scribbled in the margins. You two would have liked each other, she said, handing them over. Deshawn kept them on his desk like sacred texts. As fall deepened, word got around East Point that Deshawn had a benefactor. Some folks whispered, skeptical. Others nodded like they'd always known he was destined for more. But Deshawn didn't let it change him. He still mowed Mrs. Langley's lawn on Saturdays, still helped his brother with homework, still fixed the neighbor's toaster for a plate of cookies. But now, when he looked at the stars, he didn't just wonder if he could reach them. He started planning how, and every night before bed he'd touch the corner of Eleanor's original note, still tucked in his backpack, and whisper, "Thank you. Not for the money. For seeing him. For believing that a boy who gave up a first-class seat might just be worth betting on. Because sometimes the biggest changes don't start with a spotlight or a speech. They start with a cup of tea in the rain and a promise kept in silence." Success, Deshawn learned, wasn't just about building things that worked. It was about staying steady when the world started watching. By the time he graduated high school as valedictorian, with a full ride to MIT already in hand, people in East Point spoke his name like it carried weight. Teachers pointed to him as proof that anyone can make it. Local news crews showed up at his house, asking how it felt to beat the odds. He answered politely, always crediting his grandmother, his teachers, even the librarian who'd let him stay past closing to use the computer. But he never mentioned Eleanor, not because he was ashamed, but because their bond felt too personal to turn into a soundbite. At MIT, he threw himself into his studies with the same quiet intensity he'd shown in San Francisco. But this time he wasn't just surviving, he was connecting. He joined a student group that designed low-cost water filters for rural communities. He started tutoring kids from Boston's underserved neighborhoods through a weekend outreach program. And during his sophomore year, he launched a small nonprofit called Bright Circuit, aimed at delivering hands-on STEM kits to schools that couldn't afford lab equipment. The kits were simple: solar cells, basic motors, copper wire, instructions printed on recycled paper. But to a classroom that had never seen a real circuit board, they were magic. Bright Circuit grew slowly, fueled by late nights, donated supplies, and a growing network of student volunteers. Deshawn funded the first batch himself using a small stipend Eleanor had set aside for personal projects. He didn't ask her for more. He wanted the organization to stand on its own, proof that good ideas didn't need big budgets, just belief and elbow grease. But as Bright Circuit gained attention, featured in a university newsletter, then a local news segment, then a national education blog. The tone of the conversation began to shift. Comments started appearing online. Another sob story used to push an agenda. Rich white woman saves poor black kid. Classic. Betty didn't build anything real without her money. At first, Deshaun ignored them. He'd dealt with doubt before. But then a regional news outlet ran a 5-minute segment titled, "The Boy Who Was Saved," a piece that, while not outright hostile, framed his story as a fairy tale of benevolent rescue, implying Eleanor's support came with invisible strings. The reporter never interviewed him. They used old photos, quoted anonymous sources close to the program, and ended with a rhetorical question. Is this empowerment or performance? The video went viral in certain corners of the internet. Deshaun's inbox filled with messages, some supportive, many skeptical, a few outright cruel. One read, "You're just a prop in her guilt charity." He didn't sleep that night. Not because the words hurt, they did, but because he knew how easily truth could get twisted when people preferred a simple narrative over a complicated one. His journey wasn't about being saved. It was about being seen, and now, that moment of human connection was being reduced to a transaction. Eleanor called the next morning. She'd seen the segment. Her voice was calm, but he could hear the anger beneath it. "They don't know you, Deshaun. They don't know us." "I know," he said. "But maybe it's time people did." A week later, the local community center hosted a town hall on youth opportunity and STEM. Deshaun was invited to speak. He almost declined. He hated the spotlight. But then he remembered the kids who'd written him letters after receiving bright circuit kits. One girl from Memphis had built a mini windmill that powered her nightlight. Another boy in Detroit used the solar cell to charge his mom's phone during a blackout. Their voices mattered more than his discomfort. The night of the event, the room was packed not just with students and parents, but with reporters, skeptics, even a few online commenters who'd come to see for themselves. Deshaun walked to the mic in a plain button-down shirt. No notes, no script. He didn't start with his achievements. He started with the plane. "I was 16, he said, voice steady. "And I'd never flown before. I got upgraded to first class by accident. Next to me was a woman who looked like she'd lived 100 lives. When she struggled with her bag, I helped. When I saw she wasn't comfortable, I offered my seat. That's it. No grand plan, just doing what felt right." He paused, letting the simplicity of it sink in. 5 minutes later, she gave me a note. Said I reminded her of her grandson. Said if I ever needed anything, truly anything, to call. I didn't call for months. I was proud, maybe too proud. But when I finally did, she didn't give me a handout. She gave me a partnership. She asked for one thing: keep helping others even when it costs you something. He looked out at the crowd. That's the part no one talks about. This wasn't about charity. It was about trust. She trusted me to do good with what she gave. And I trusted her not to take it back if I stumbled. Then he told them about Bright Circuit, not as a success story, but as a response. "Every kit we send out is because someone once believed in me enough to say, 'Go build.' And I figured if one person's belief could change my life, maybe a box of parts could do the same for someone else." After he finished, there was silence. Then applause, not polite but real, the kind that starts in the chest and spills out. In the back of the room, Eleanor stood quietly, hands folded, tears in her eyes. She hadn't come for recognition. She'd come to witness the ripple. Later, as people milled about, a young girl, maybe 10 with braids and bright eyes, approached Deshaun. She held out a small device made of cardboard wires and a tiny spinning blade. "I built this," she said shyly. "It's a fan. For my baby brother. He gets hot at night." Deshaun knelt so he was at her level. "Did it work?" She nodded, beaming. "He slept all night," he smiled. "Then you're already an engineer." She hugged him, quick, fierce, and ran back to her mom. In that moment, Deshaun understood. The story wasn't about him or Eleanor. It was about the chain of kindness that started with a seat on a plane and ended with a little girl cooling her brother's room with something she'd made herself. The news outlet that had run the skeptical segment reached out a week later, asking for a follow-up interview. This time, Deshaun agreed, but only if they spoke to the students too. The resulting piece was different. It showed kids assembling circuits, teachers describing how engagement had soared. Parents saying their children now talked about college like it was possible. And at the end, a short clip of Eleanor filmed in her garden. I didn't give him a future. I just helped clear some weeds so he could grow. After that, the noise online faded. Not because everyone was convinced, but because real stories are harder to dismiss than rumors. Deshaun kept building. Bright Circuit expanded to 50 schools in 3 years. He hired his first full-time staff member, a former student from East Point who'd used one of the early kits. He still tutored on weekends, still called his mom every Sunday, still visited Eleanor now more often, bringing her updates, photos, sometimes just silence over tea. One afternoon, as they sat on her porch watching hummingbirds dart between flowers, she said, "You've done more with that note than I ever imagined." He shook his head. "I just passed it on, and that was the truth." The note hadn't changed everything because of what it offered. It changed everything because it reminded him that goodness exists, and that sometimes all it takes to keep it alive is one person choosing to believe in another. No grand speeches, no viral moments, just a boy, a seat, and a promise kept, one small act at a time. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, just as Deshaun was reviewing blueprints for a new solar-powered classroom prototype in rural Alabama. The voice on the other end was Rosa, Eleanor's longtime assistant, calm but heavy with something unspoken. "She's asking for you," Rosa said. "She's at home, but it won't be long." Deshaun didn't hesitate. He booked the next flight to San Francisco, packed a small bag, and left instructions with his team. He didn't tell anyone why he was going, just that it was personal. Because it was. More than a mentor, more than a benefactor. Eleanor had become the closest thing he had to family since his grandmother passed. She'd never tried to replace her. She just walked beside him, steady and quiet. Like a lighthouse you didn't notice until you realized how much you'd been steering by its light. When he arrived at her house, the garden was in full bloom, roses, lavender, and those little white flowers Julian used to press into his science notebooks. Eleanor was in her favorite armchair by the window, wrapped in a soft blanket thinner than he remembered, but her eyes still sharp, still warm. She smiled when she saw him. "You came," she said, as if she'd been holding her breath. "Of course I did," he replied, kneeling beside her chair like he had 100 times before, only this time his throat felt tight. They didn't talk about illness or goodbyes. Not right away. Instead, she asked about the Alabama project. He told her about the school. No reliable electricity, kids doing homework by phone light, and how the new design used recycled materials and could be assembled by students themselves. Her eyes lit up the way they always did when he talked about building something that mattered. Then, after a long silence, she reached for his hand. Her skin was paper thin, but her grip was firm. "Do you remember what I told you on that rainy day in East Point?" she asked. "That I reminded you of Julian," he said softly. She nodded. "I was flying to meet my lawyer that day, the day we met on the plane. I'd decided to change my will, remove everyone. I thought, no one deserved what I'd built. Not after losing him. I'd shut the world out so completely I forgot how to hope." She paused, her gaze drifting to the garden. "Then you gave me your seat. Not because you wanted something, not because you knew who I was, just because you saw someone who needed it more. In that moment, you gave me back something I thought was gone forever." "What was that?" Deshaun asked, though he already knew. "Faith," she whispered. "In people. In kindness. In the idea that one good act can still mean something." Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't look away. "You gave me more than faith, Eleanor. You gave me a chance to prove I was worth it." "You were always worth it," she said firmly. "I just helped you see it." Over the next few days, Deshaun stayed with her. He read to her from Julian's old astronomy journals. They listened to jazz records from her youth. Sometimes they just sat in silence, watching the fog roll in from the bay. On her last clear morning, she asked him to promise one more thing. "Speak at my service," she said. "Not as a beneficiary. As yourself. Tell them what really happened on that plane." "I will," he said. She passed 2 nights later peacefully with Rosa and Deshaun by her side. The memorial was held in the garden she loved. Under a sky so clear it felt like Julian was watching too. Dignitaries came. Former colleagues, distant relatives, people who'd known her name but not her heart. They spoke of her legacy in business, her philanthropy, her elegance. Then it was Deshaun's turn. He stepped up to the simple wooden podium. No notes, just the truth in his chest. "I'm not here to talk about money," he began. his voice calm but strong. "I'm here to talk about a moment. One seat, one choice." One note passed in the dark. He told them about the flight, about his fear, his pride, his grandmother's dream. He spoke of Eleanor not as a savior, but as a witness, someone who saw his humanity when the world often looked past it. He talked about the promise they'd made to each other, to keep helping even when it cost something. "And that's what she left behind," he said, looking out at the crowd. "Not just buildings or bank accounts, but a belief that ordinary kindness can change everything." After the service, a lawyer handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a copy of her final will. Most of her estate, her home, her investments, her art collection, was bequeathed to Bright Circuit. But there was one condition, written in her own hand at the bottom. Every scholarship recipient must perform one anonymous act of kindness before receiving funds. Deshawn read it 3 times. Then he smiled through tears. Of course she'd do that. She never wanted gratitude. She wanted continuation. Back in Atlanta, he stood in the lobby of Bright Circuit's new headquarters, a modest building in a neighborhood that once had no STEM programs at all. On the wall, in a simple wooden frame, hung the original note she'd given him on the plane. Beneath it, in his own handwriting, he'd added a single line. "Kindness doesn't need an audience, but it always finds one." Years later, a young woman named Tasha, who'd received her first robotics kit from Bright Circuit at age 12, stood in that same lobby, now as the program's lead instructor. She'd just returned from installing solar panels at a school in Puerto Rico, funded by Eleanor's endowment. Before her first class, she paused by the framed note, running her fingers over the glass. A student asked, "Who wrote that?" Tasha smiled. "Someone who believed a small thing could grow." And in that moment, the circle held. Deshawn never became famous in the way the world measures it. No magazine covers, no viral fame. But in classrooms across the country, in labs built from hope and spare parts, in the quiet choices of kids who now saw themselves as builders, not just bystanders, his legacy lived. Not because he was perfect, but because he'd been willing to give up a seat, accept a note, and pass on the belief that one person's kindness could echo far beyond a single lifetime. Eleanor had once told him that legacies aren't built in stone, they're built in people. And as he watched another group of students light up a bulb using nothing but sunlight and wire, he knew she'd been right all along. The note hadn't changed everything in a flash. It had changed everything slowly, quietly, one act at a time, just like kindness always does.